Day 886 of the Trump administration, and the president is again punishing Iran days after suddenly reversing a decision to launch military strikes to retaliate for the downing of an unmanned U.S. drone. He's imposing new sanctions now targeting Iran's leadership.
Today's action follows a series of aggressive behaviors by the Iranian regime in recent weeks, including shooting down of U.S. drones. We will continue to increase pressure on Tehran until the regime abandons its dangerous activities and its aspirations, including the pursuit of nuclear weapons. I look forward to discussing whatever I have to discuss with anybody that wants to speak. In the meantime, who knows what's going to happen? I can only tell you we cannot ever let Iran have a nuclear weapon.
Just days ago, we learned of Trump's decision to stop an attack on Iranian targets just as it was about to begin. The reversal came hours after the president said this.
They made a very bad mistake.
How will you respond, Mr. President? How will you respond?
You'll find out.
Are you willing to go to war with Iran?
You'll find out. You'll find out.
Trump's handling of Iran is renewing concerns that his negotiating style of pushing toward the brink, then pulling back just before carrying out on a threat, is putting our nation somehow at risk. The Associated Press writes tonight that Trump's, quote, abrupt decision against military strikes may have prevented open military conflict with Iran, but it also showed him anew to be an unpredictable, unreliable partner at home and abroad. On trade tariffs, immigration raids, now the standoff with Iran, his course reversals confound allies as well as adversaries and his own party in Congress. Here's another example. Exactly 1 week ago, Trump sent out this warning, and we quote, next week, ICE will begin the process of removing the millions of illegal aliens who have illicitly found their way into the United States. They will be removed as fast as they come in. Then on Saturday, a day before the deportations were to begin, he wrote, at the request of Democrats, I've delayed the illegal immigration removal process, deportation, for 2 weeks to see if the Democrats and Republicans can get together and work out a solution to the asylum and loophole, capital L, problems at the southern border. If not, deportations start. Our NBC News colleague Julia Ainsley reports that 2 DHS officials say Sunday's raids were called off in large part because details of the plans had leaked to us in the media. The Washington Post reports this about Trump, and we quote, policy turnarounds by President Trump this month have underscored his freewheeling governing style, an approach that some experts warn sends mixed messages and puts U.S. national security at risk. They add, Trump is increasingly employing brinksmanship in an effort to achieve key policy goals. Here for our leadoff discussion on a fresh Monday night, we're fortunate to have these first 3 guests: Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at CIA and the Pentagon, former chief counsel for House Intel; Annie Carney, White House reporter with the New York Times; and Philip Rucker, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House bureau chief for the Washington Post. Annie, I'd like to begin with you. Do you indeed, fueled by your reporting or simple observations, see this as a theme?
It's certainly a theme. He likes to go to the brink. It's brinksmanship. Threaten some severe action, and in the last minute, pull it back. Now, the question is here, is he achieving policy goals through this style of governing? The answer is sometimes a little bit, sometimes not much. What is the after effect of this? We've seen it here on the Iran strike, on the tariffs with Mexico that he threatened and then at the last minute reversed course, and on the ICE raids. And one thing that's in common with all these pieces here is that often, even while making the threat, he doesn't make it clear what actions would stop him from taking that action. For instance, when he announced the tariffs on Mexico, it was very vague what actions Mexico could take to stop him from imposing the tariffs completely. On the night they were announced, the chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, said they will be looking at Mexico's actions on a day-to-day basis. It wasn't clear what actions need to be taken for the ICE raids to be put off permanently, not just for the next 2 weeks. And it's not clear what casualty number would have deterred Trump, would have not deterred Trump from making that strike against Iran. So his actions also are not explained.
Jeremy Bash, a dual question to you. Everybody likes having optionality and wiggle room, but A, what kind of signal does this send to our allies? B, How should we be treating Iran right about now?
Well, the president, I think, made three big mistakes. First, he minimized the strike against a U.S. flagged aircraft in international airspace. It wasn't an accident, as the president suggested. It was a third effort by Iran to down U.S. aircraft. The first was successful over Yemen the week before last. And they shot at one of our Predators, which we put over top the stricken tanker the week before last. And then they took down, for the first time, a U.S. flagged carrier in international airspace over international waters. So first, he minimized it. Second, he yanked the operation out from under the troops. And I think anytime you give a command downrange, you have to have clarity and discipline. You don't want the troops at the strike group commander level or the wing commander level looking over their shoulder, wondering whether or not the president is going to pull back an order. And third, he told an obvious falsehood that he called it off because of civilian casualties. We all know he was briefed about that hours before. That was not the reason. I think he just lost his nerve. What should we do? I think we have to be prepared for military action, and everyone should not be breathing a sigh of relief. If the Iranians now feel emboldened by the president's lack of action and they take another shot at one of our aircraft in international airspace, I think it's going to be game on. I think we have to tighten the screws, get our allies lined up. Our posture in the region has to be pretty aggressive. I like the sanctions action, and I think there are other ways to pressurize them. But ultimately, we have to know what our end game is, drive them back to the negotiating table and get back into this Iran deal.
Phil Rucker, Speaker Pelosi has said take no action against Iran without Congress's approval. The president was asked about that today by the TV arm of the publication The Hill. We'll play the clip for you, talk about it on the other side.
I like the idea of keeping Congress abreast, but I wouldn't have to do that.
Sure. But Nancy Pelosi actually said you must have congressional approval. So you disagree with her on that?
I disagree. I think most people seem to disagree, but I do like keeping them. They have ideas, that intelligent people, they'll come up with some thoughts. I actually learned a couple of things the other day when we had our meeting with Congress, which were, I think, helpful to me. But I do like keeping them abreast, but I don't have to do it legally.
Phil Rucker, we need, alas, a viewer's guide to what we just heard there. What is the truth?
Well, what you just heard there, Brian, is a president who is trying to act all-powerful, but he is indeed part of a co-equal branch of government. The executive branch is equal to the legislative branch. Congress controls the power of the purse, and that is why Congress, traditionally in this country, is given advance warning of these sorts of things and is consulted about these sorts of moves. And it's interesting, the mission, the attack that Trump was set to authorize in Iran last week, he did not communicate anything about that to Speaker Pelosi or to other leaders in Congress. That's according to their accounts. And so we'll see if he does that in the future. But he does not seem inclined to do that. He doesn't seem to value their input or really respect the power of the offices that they hold.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.